Hello, Alexandra here. Today I'm going to talk about stage transitions, specifically transitioning, exiting orange, entering green, stabilizing in green, exiting green, and entering yellow. When you read the book Spiral Dynamics by Don Beck and Christopher Cohen, you're going to notice that they talk about these different transitions and they give information specific to these transitions. So I'm going to talk about these, and why this is important is if you are in a transition, you might be having a hard time right now, and knowing where you are in this transition helps you to see that there will be an end to the transition. You will eventually stabilize in the next stage, and whatever you're going through personally, emotionally, can be worked through. A lot of times, as you know, when we go through transitions, it's kicked off by a difficult life event. And by struggling through that life event and learning better coping skills, by growing, by stretching, by increasing our capacities, that's how we begin to transition and progress through the next stage. So you may have noticed that as you're shifting into green, it coincides with the loss of a relationship. Maybe you went through a difficult experience with the loss of a job or being laid off. Maybe you experienced the loss of a loved one or another difficult thing. Or, maybe you've just maxed out the previous stage. So let me talk about that. First, maxing out stage orange. You may have noticed that you had got to a point in your life where you thought, is this all there is? You have the job you wanted, or you reached your goals, you were very goal-oriented, very achievement-oriented, maybe exhausting yourself and overdoing it. You may be exhausting yourself in your job. You may be exhausting yourself when you're working out. You're pushing, and you realize this is not fulfilling. So you realize there's got to be something else, and you just begin searching. So you might start meditating. Some people start getting into New Age, and for me, I started reading Deepak Chopra. I started doing transcendental meditation, and I started studying Ayurveda. And this is what was happening when I was maxing out orange. It was very light study. It was the first time I'd ever read or did anything like that. And what I noticed at the time was that transitional event was I was in a relationship with someone, living with someone at the time I thought I might marry. And there was some problems, and I went to counseling specifically to consider if I wanted to stay in that relationship. So I started simultaneously maxing out orange a little bit, exploring some new things lightly. This is exiting stage orange. And also I began working on myself. And I discovered, yes, counseling brought up some issues, and some of it was very difficult to go through, but quite frankly, I began to really enjoy it. And I began to really prioritize and value inner work. And you may have experienced the same thing I did. When you started getting into new interests like meditation or, anything out of the conventional, your orange friends or your orange partner might call you weird. This has happened to me when I was exiting orange. My partner at the time thought that transcendental meditation was a, quote, cult. And certainly it's not. And I've also had a friend who was told she was woo-woo shoo-shoo for practicing meditation and yoga and the like by her orange partner. So you may notice you're sort of leaving some people behind with your new interests at late orange. And, for me, exiting orange was about a couple of years. And as I was entering green, that was also a couple of years. Green was when I entered green, I found a friend who went to a New Age church, and at that it was actually at a bookstore. So I got to read about shamanism, and I got to read about being an empath, and I got to explore my intuition, and I even took exploring intuition to the nth degree. For a stint, I did readings, and later, much later, as I stabilized in yellow, I left that behind because I found that stage green was just too open, and I don't want to know about other people. I was constantly getting downloads and hits about other people, and I found that to be very difficult, to be in a group of people and to be getting all this psychic information. And when I got to yellow, I just realized, no, I don't want to be open. I don't want to know. I don't want all this energy coming in. And I actually started working on blocking that. So when you're in stage green, you've entered stage green, it is a very open stage. You might not get into all the new agey stuff, but you'll find yourself having much more of a profound empathy. And that, for me, that couple years of adjustment time was realizing I was so different than I had been, and I was so different now than the rest of my family and a lot of my acquaintances, and having to adjust to that, and sort of the shock of going from these wonderful experiences with my friends who were more at green, and we were doing my friend, we would have a fire pit, and we'd have, one of them was a shaman, and one was a pagan, and we would do these we were having a lot of fun little ceremonies. And by the way, I learned so much about my intuition, and that was all about learning when to trust my intuition and when not to. And all of these sort of out of the ordinary activities gave me chances to listen to my inner voice and download information about myself. And I found out a lot of the time I was wrong. So all of this practice, this intuition-based practice, was extremely useful, because eventually I got to be very in tune with my intuition and very pragmatic about it. At yellow, you also blend in common sense, so it's a much more grounded stage. But getting back to that early transition, I was experimenting with intuition. I was learning how to practice discretion with my orange family and friends. I learned what to talk about, what not to talk about, and I also learned that sometimes I needed to withhold how sensitive and how empathetic I was, because I was told I was, quote, too giving by some of my orange family members. And the funny part of that is, what they didn't realize is they were still very orange, very direct, would always share opinions about me that maybe weren't relevant and were maybe a little invasive, but that generous side of me was holding space for them. So that's just pretty funny, because if I would have stopped being open, I would have pulled back and spent less time with my family members. So they didn't realize that my openness and my sensitivity was actually a gift, and it was a gift to them, by the way. So you might start, when you're just getting into early green, realizing, number one, you might feel like a stranger in a strange land with all of your heightened intuition, and also the majority of the people who are in the conventional stages, orange and blue, they might seem kind of strange to you now, because it's almost startling at this point how the majority of the population doesn't prioritize inner work. Sure, they might work on themselves or go to counseling from time to time when they feel like they really need it or they really have to, but for green, inner work can be a beautiful lifestyle. So when I'm talking about transitions, if you're going through a hard time and you are listening to this material and you feel like you've exited orange, you're entering green, for me, that was about 4 years total before I really stabilized in green. And when you stabilize in a stage, you've kind of got the stage down. You know how to handle being around the people at previous stages. You're comfortable with yourself. You found maybe your tribe. You found friends at your stage. And then, of course, everything changes, and eventually you will be maxing out that stage, exiting that stage, and in another transition. So for me, and you may have experienced this, another transition happened when I made a big move. I moved to a big city. I sold my house. I left behind my family. I left behind my friends. I had just felt that I was looking for something, a more concrete lifestyle. I'd been in the subjective. I really wanted to get out of that and get into a more grounded lifestyle. So I also am a musician, and I was taking acting classes at the time. So I just moved to Chicago and started taking classes at Second City and Improv Olympic and some acting classes in Chicago. And I met up with a professor who had taught at a university in St. Louis to continue my jazz studies. And so you can see that I went from out there and new agey back to being goal-oriented and pragmatic at Stage Yellow, while being very, very authentic. And after I moved to Chicago, the transition lasted a couple of years. I didn't have very many friends. It was actually weird not being around my family, who they're at Stage Orange and they know how to throw a party. Boy, with group activities, they are fun. And not having that, my friend calls it the family infusion, I felt a loss. And not having my close friends anymore, I went through this sort of period of isolation because I hadn't found my new tribe in Stage Yellow yet. And what happened is I started journaling, and I was just downloading and writing about the Greek archetypes. And I would spend a lot of time alone and journaling. And lo and behold, I found the book, 3 books, a trifecta. Gods in Every Man, Goddesses in Every Woman, Goddesses in Older Women. And this had been what I was downloading. And so I talked about in a previous video, when we transition into yellow, we go through a very, mine was very noticeable. I mentioned it's like the sound thunk. Everything coagulates, everything makes sense. My mind became very organized on the inside because I began to journal about these archetypes, because they have pluses and minuses, positive traits and shortcomings, and everything came together on the inside. And I met a new group of friends, I got a new job, and all of a sudden I was in Stage Yellow. But that exiting green after I moved took a couple of years. And I also had been dating someone who went to AA, and so I decided to join Al-Anon. And I'd heard somebody mention it years before. They said they liked it, so I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. And it was nothing like I thought. I'm in a big city, and it's a very thriving city for healthy and positive 12-step programs. I walked in and I couldn't figure out, why are these people even here? I landed in this meeting where I ended up getting a sponsor, and honest to goodness, as fate would have it, as the universe would have it, I began being sponsored, I think, at Stage Yellow and Stage Teal. And my life just became so much easier. Again, I mentioned that sometimes greens have a hard time making money because they care so very little about money. So the money thing just fixed itself. I had a network, and I was on a path of clarity, on the wisdom path. And so we're looking at exiting orange. This happened to me around 1998, entering green around the year 2000. Stabilizing green in green a couple years later, exiting green around the year 2008, stabilizing in yellow around the year 2009. So you can see that entering and exiting and being in transition can last a few years. So that's why studying the stages and studying stage green and yellow and orange can help you see where you are in your transition, so that if you're going through a really difficult time, you know that you are going somewhere, that there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So I wanted to just touch on these transitions, and I do want to mention one more thing. Stage green itself is a transitional stage. If you read the wonderful PDF 9 Levels of Increasing Embrace by Suzanne Cook-Greuter, the stage is pluralist, and it's stage 4/5. The stage itself is a transitional stage. And that's why not only the transitions can be hard, because transitions are just hard in general, but the stage itself, you can have a hard time at it, because it's a transitional stage. It's transitioning into the stage she calls strategist or autonomous, which is stage yellow. So you might be transitioning into green. You might be in deep green, which is a transitional stage. You might be exiting green and noticing that you've left a relationship or moved, or you might be experiencing a lot of inner adjustments, and know that you are on your way somewhere. And if you get that help, the 12-step, the counseling, that is going to propel you or stabilize you in a stage and help you get through the transitions. And I want to mention one last quick thing. I went into stage green at age 30. Now, there are people of all ages at all stages, and the stage greens I've met, I exited stage green around age 39. But the greens I meet when they're 60-year-old, when they're 70-year-old, when they're 70-plus-year-old, 75-plus-year-old, who I've talked to, don't necessarily struggle the same way greens when they are 30 or 40 years old going into green. And that's because I've noticed they're not struggling with money, because they've had a career, they've had been established in their career, and they might not even transition until they're retiring. So money's not an issue. Also, they have so much more life experience, so many more years they've had to work on themselves or experience life, or maybe they are enjoying grandkids. And so while they may be transitioning and going through transition into retirement, feeling the loss of their identity from their job, or they might have a health issue, it just doesn't seem to be as destabilizing, not always, but in general for someone who is more mature. So I don't, even when I say green is so hard, it's so hard, it really, for me, because I went in at age 30, and I went in without any guidance on the stages, and so I didn't have a stage role model. I didn't watch videos. I didn't have the PDF until I found it online. It helped me stabilize in stage yellow, because I finally figured out what had been going on. So if you're listening to this and you're mature, you may not have as hard of a time. But I was just talking to someone who's about, I don't know, he's 70, 75 years old, and he mentioned he's in counseling and he's at stage green. And while counseling, of course, can be difficult, we both were talking and saying we wouldn't trade anything for doing the inner work. So I hope you found this material useful, and if you're in transition, hold on, you're going somewhere. Get those resources, use those resources, counseling, 12-step, to help yourself and to help yourself get through the transitions. And make sure to watch various videos about stage green and stage yellow, so you'll know where you're headed. And it won't be so hard knowing that there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, because things are easier when you stabilize in green instead of being in transition, and they are much easier at stage yellow because you've done a lot of work on yourself by then. So sending you love and blessings, and see you in the next video.